Welcome to the Sleep of Valor. Tonight's story is about Richard the Lionheart, a king remembered not only for the wars he fought, but for the silence he left in the memories of those who spoke his name. Before we follow Richard himself, before his name was sung in song or carved into stone, we must first step into his age, the 12th century. A century of stone and shadow, of banners and bells, of faith and fear. The land was heavy with castles. Gray towers rose like teeth against the horizon. Some newly built, their walls still smelling of mortar and lime. Others ancient and weathered, their stones blackened by fire and siege. From their battlements, guards scanned the distance, for enemies were never far. A world of crowns and swords cannot rest. Beyond the castles, villages dotted the countryside. Thatched roofs leaned beneath the wind. Smoke curled from chimneys, mixing with the mist of dawn. Children ran barefoot across mud paths, chasing one another between pens of pigs and chickens. Mothers carried buckets of water from the wells. Fathers bent their backs in the fields, iron plows dragging through stubborn soil. In the towns, narrow streets wound between wooden houses. Merchants called out in rough voices, offering bolts of cloth, salted fish, casks of ale. Coins clinked, hands shook, disputes flared, then quieted again. The smell of sweat, smoke, and spice filled the air. Dogs barked. Bells tolled from distant towers, marking the hours of labor, the hours of prayer. And always there was the church. Its shadow fell long across both village and city. Cathedrals rose, vast and solemn, their stained glass windows catching the sun, scattering it into pools of red and blue across cold stone floors. Inside, choirs lifted voices that echoed into arches so high they seemed to touch heaven. Monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, their quills scratching in endless patience. The faith of the age was not only belief, but life was fragile. A poor harvest meant hunger. A harsh winter could strip a village bare. Sickness spread without warning, stealing the young and the old alike. War swept through fields like fire, leaving ashes where wheat once stood. In this world, survival was not promised. Every day was a gift clawed from the jaws of uncertainty. And yet, there was beauty. On warm summer nights, music drifted from castle halls, where troubadours plucked strings and sang of distant love. At village festivals, laughter and dancing carried into the dark, as bonfires lit the faces of the weary. In markets, the colors of fabrics, the gleam of silver, the scent of roasting meat reminded all that life was more than toil. Even in the midst of hardship, men and women dreamed. It was also the age of the night. Young squires rose before dawn, their breath misting in the cold air. They carried buckets of water, polished armor until it shone, and trained with wooden blades until their arms trembled. Knighthood was not simply privilege, it was trial. It was patience, bruises, discipline. And when at last the day of knighting came, when spurs were strapped and swords blessed, it was not only the making of a warrior, it was the making of a story. And far beyond Europe, the East called, Jerusalem, a city of stone and faith, whispered in every sermon, prayed for in every chapel. Men dreamed of dying within its walls, believing paradise awaited them beyond its gates. Kings dreamed of holding it, believing their names would echo forever if they did. This was the 12th century. This was the world of Richard's birth. A world divided by ambition and bound by belief. A world of iron and of incense. A world where a single man might carve his place in history with the edge of a sword and the weight of his heart. And so, before you drift into his story, close your eyes. Hear the tolling. Servants hurried through corridors, their steps echoing. Midwives whispered prayers, their hands trembling as they worked. Priests murmured blessings in Latin, sprinkling holy water, their voices a steady chant above the chaos of birth. And when at last the infant was lifted, when the wail filled the chamber, the hall fell into silence. He was not the first son of Henry and Eleanor. He was not born to a quiet inheritance. He was born into a storm of power, of politics, of ambition. And yet from the beginning, there was weight in him. Even as a child, those who saw him whispered, "This boy is marked." Oxford itself was alive with murmurs that night. Outside the castle walls, villagers spoke of omens, of stars that gleamed brighter than before, of the sudden cry of owls, of the restless neighing of horses. Such signs were common in the 12th century. Every birth of royalty was measured against the skies, against the voice of nature, against the hand of God. Within days, Richard was baptized. The waters poured upon his head were not only a blessing, they were a seal. For in that age, a prince's birth was not merely family, it was destiny. Priests intoned the rites, the echo of their voices rising into the vaulted chamber. Candles smoked and guttered, casting long shadows across the stone. The boy, swaddled in linen, blinked at the light and drifted into silence. Outside the walls, life went on. Merchants opened their stalls, selling bread and cloth. Peasants trudged through mud, carrying firewood on bent backs. Few of them knew of the child born in Oxford's halls, and yet unknowingly, their lives would one day be shaped by him. For this boy would not remain hidden in cradle or chamber. He would rise, and his footsteps would echo across kingdoms. Outside, that night Queen Eleanor looked upon her son. Her gaze was steady, proud, unyielding. She had seen courts greater than this, had worn one crown and now another. She knew the weight of kingdoms, the fragility of... To understand Richard, we must first understand the two forces that shaped him. His father, Henry II, and his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Henry was a king of iron. He rose to power not through gentle words, but through will that would not bend. He built an empire that stretched from the green hills of Ireland, across England, through Normandy, Anjou, and into Aquitaine. It was said that his dominion was greater than that of the French king himself. And yet, the greater the empire, the greater the unrest. Henry was restless, tireless. He rose before dawn, striding through halls with parchments in hand, barking orders to clerks and knights alike. His beard bristled, his eyes burned, his voice carried the sharpness of command. He was a man who sought control in all things, lands, courts, and even his children. From Henry, Richard would inherit strength. Not only the strength of arm, but the strength of will, a refusal to bend, a refusal to yield. Yet along with this gift came a shadow, the fire of temper, the thirst for power, the pride that would never kneel. If Henry was iron, Eleanor was flame. She was unlike any queen before her. Born the Duchess of Aquitaine, she inherited lands richer than any in France. As a young woman, she had been crowned Queen of France, only to cast aside that crown when her marriage to King Louis failed. She crossed the lines of power with courage few men dared. And when she married Henry, she carried with her not only lands, but spirit. Eleanor was proud, fierce, and cultured. She surrounded herself with poets and troubadours. Her courts in Aquitaine rang with music and verse, where knights were judged not only by the sword they carried, but by the songs they sang, by the loyalty they swore, by the honor they displayed. She believed that nobility was not only power, but refinement, not only conquest, but beauty. From Eleanor, Richard inherited fire, not the fire that burns and dies, but the fire that endures, that spreads, that illuminates. She taught him not only to wield a blade, but to master words, to honor song, to understand the hearts of men. It was said that in his mother's presence, Richard was most alive, and when she spoke, he listened with a gravity rare in sons. But Henry and Eleanor were not a peaceful pair. Their marriage was forged in power, not in tenderness. Storms rose often between them, quarrels, accusations, rebellions. Even their children were drawn into their strife. The Plantagenet house was not a family, it was a battlefield. Yet for Richard, this storm was a crucible. From his father he learned strength without rest. From his mother he learned fire without end. And between iron and flame, the boy was shaped. This was the forge of Richard's youth. He was born into a house of power that could not be contained, a house where every voice sought to command, a house where love and betrayal walked side by side. And within this house, Richard grew, the son of iron, the son of fire, the boy who would become the Lionheart. Richard's childhood was not soft. He was not raised among gardens of ease, but within halls of stone, where every step echoed with the weight of expectation. His earliest teachers were monks, men wrapped in dark robes, their voices steady, their hands stained with ink. They taught him Latin, the language of scripture and law. They guided his fingers across parchment, showing him how to shape letters, how to read the words of saints, how to recite prayers that had echoed for centuries. The monastery was silent, save for the scratching of quills and the chanting of psalms. Richard listened. He absorbed not only the words, but the gravity behind them. Faith was not an idea in his childhood. Faith was air itself. But beyond prayer and scripture, there was discipline. He was taught that a prince must rise with the dawn, that his body must be as strong as his will, that idleness was a kind of sin. So before the sun had climbed the horizon, Richard was already in the yard. Wooden swords struck against shields, their cracks ringing in the cold morning. His arms ached, his shoulders burned, his hands blistered. But each day the ache grew less. Each day his grip grew firmer. Each day the boy edged closer to the warrior he would become. By 10 years old, he could sit a horse with ease. By 12, he could handle a lance with strength that surprised grown men. The great war horses, restless and fierce, settled beneath his touch. It was said they sensed something in him, a steadiness, a command that few could summon. And yet, Richard was not only a student of war. In the evenings, when torches burned low and the halls quieted, he listened to songs. Troubadours came to Eleanor's courts, singing of loyalty, of love, of battles fought and lost. Their words flowed like rivers, weaving images of glory and sorrow. The boy sat in silence, drinking in every note. Soon, he tried his own hand at verse. Simple at first, clumsy rhymes, childish melodies. But even then, there was strength in his voice, a depth that seemed to belong to a man far older. For in Richard, the sword and the song lived side by side. Steel in one hand, poetry in the other. The people around him saw it too. Knights whispered that the boy had the makings of a commander. Poets murmured that he had the heart of a troubadour. And priests said that his will was already as unyielding as stone. It was in these years that Richard began to stand apart. Not simply another royal son, not simply another boy in training, but a figure already touched by destiny. A child forged in discipline, crowned with learning, sharpened by both blade and word. And when he walked through the castle halls at night, torchlight flickering across stone, servants paused in their steps. For even then, there was a weight about him, the sense that this boy would not live an ordinary life, that one day history itself would bow to his presence. These were Richard's first lessons of prayer and patience, lessons of steel and song, lessons that would shape him into the lion he was destined to become. If the monasteries gave Richard discipline, it was Aquitaine that gave him soul. His mother, Eleanor, was not only a queen, she was a patron of art, of poetry, of the music that flowed like lifeblood through the south of France. Her courts were unlike those of the north. Where others echoed with the sound of armor and argument, hers shimmered with the strings of lutes, the notes of harps, the verses of troubadours. Aquitaine was rich in vineyards, in rivers, in hills touched by sunlight. Its culture was equally rich. Here men spoke not only of war, but of honor, of loyalty, of love that demanded sacrifice. Songs told of knights who rode not only for conquest, but for devotion. Devotion to God, to king, to lady. It was in these songs that Richard first heard the ideals of chivalry. The halls of Eleanor's court glowed with torchlight as troubadours sang. Their voices wove tales of distant lands, of heroes who braved despair, of lovers who defied kingdoms for one another. Children gathered at the edges, eyes wide, hearts stirred. Richard was among them, listening, always listening. He learned that power was more than command. It was the ability to inspire. That a man who carried both sword and song carried twice the weight of legend. And so, even as he trained in arms, he also trained in words, crafting verses, shaping melodies, letting his own heart echo the ideals he heard. It was said that Richard could sing with a voice deep and steady, carrying across the hall until every ear was silent. When he sang, knights forgot their boasting, ladies leaned forward, eyes glistening. Even troubadours paused, acknowledging that in this boy there was more than imitation. There was truth. But Aquitaine's courts were not merely places of beauty. They were places of politics, of subtle maneuvering. Behind the songs lay questions of loyalty. Behind the dances lay glances heavy with meaning. Richard saw this too, that art could mask ambition, that words could conceal daggers. This duality, the song and the sword, the beauty and the betrayal, sank deep into Richard's soul. He would be remembered as a warrior, yes, but he would also be remembered as one of the last kings to compose verse with his own hand. One of the few rulers whose name echoed not only in chronicles, but in melodies. Aquitaine gave him more than culture, it gave him identity. The fire of Eleanor was not only in her politics, but in her love of beauty, and that fire burned in Richard as well. He was not content to be a king of iron alone. He would be a king whose heart carried both steel and song. Thus, in the halls of Aquitaine, the boy became more than a prince. He became a troubadour of destiny, a lion who would roar not only in battle, but in verse. By the time Richard reached 17, the boy had become a man. The discipline of the monasteries had hardened him, the culture of Aquitaine had given him fire, and now both would be tested. Aquitaine was a land proud and restless. Its lords were fierce, its people unwilling to bow too long. They resented the rule of outsiders, even of kings who bore their duchess as wife. And when rebellion rose in the south, Richard was called to put it down. The young duke rode at the head of an army. Knights flanked him, banners whipping in the wind, the lions of England and the colors of Aquitaine carried together. Many whispered he was too young, that no youth could command seasoned men. But those whispers faded when they saw him in battle, for Richard carried himself with a calm that was older than his years. Castles that resisted him soon fell beneath his siege engines. Stone walls crumbled under the rhythm of mangonels. Gates shuddered and splintered as rams struck them again and again. Cities that thought themselves safe opened their doors in surrender. Where others faltered, Richard pressed forward without hesitation. Yet he was not only steel, he rewarded loyalty. He spoke to soldiers with words that carried both command and respect. Knights who fought under him swore that his presence alone gave courage, and even those who opposed him found themselves admiring his resolve. Still, the rebellions were not only against distant lords. Within his own family, storms brewed. His elder brother Henry, called the Young King, grew jealous. Geoffrey in Brittany schemed in shadows, and John, the youngest, whispered ambitions, though he bore no crown. The Plantagenet sons were not brothers united. They were rivals bound by blood. When Eleanor herself rose against Henry II, Richard stood at her side. The bond between mother and son was unbroken, forged in trust, in fire, in shared defiance. The young lion bared his teeth against the father of iron. The war shook the empire. Father against son, brother against brother, castles burned, villages emptied, blood spilled across fields that had once known only harvest. And though Richard fought with fury, the rebellion failed. Eleanor was captured, her freedom taken, her voice silenced behind stone walls. Richard, though spared, carried the scar. He had seen the cost of defiance. He had seen how power could devour even a family. But he had also learned a lesson he would never forget, that loyalty to one's own heart was worth the risk of chains. The rebellions passed, but Richard's name remained, not as the boy who followed others, but as the young commander who had led men, who had stood against kings, who had tasted both victory and loss. In Aquitaine, in England, in France, his reputation grew. The Lionheart was not yet crowned, but his roar had already begun to echo. By the time Richard crossed into manhood, the boy of Oxford had become a commander. Armies no longer looked at him as a prince carried by his name, but as a leader who carried himself with fire and steadiness. Aquitaine's rebellions had tested him. Stone fortresses had fallen beneath his command. Lords who once mocked his youth now bent the knee, for they had seen the fury of his sieges, the patience of his campaigns, the mercy he could grant, and the judgment he could withhold. Soldiers who marched under him spoke in hushed awe. They said his presence alone steadied a line, that when fear threatened to shatter courage, the sight of Richard upon his horse was enough to hold them firm. Some swore that in the clamor of battle, when the air thickened with dust and blood, he seemed untouched by chaos, as though a stillness moved with him, even as swords clashed around him. His enemies learned this too. Rebellious lords of the South whispered that to face Richard was to face inevitability, that resistance was a question of when, not if. And slowly, the murmurs of his name began to spread beyond Aquitaine, beyond France, across the Channel to England. At feasts, minstrels began to sing of him, not as a king, for he wore no crown yet, but as a lion in waiting. They told of his strength with the sword, his skill in command, his voice that could silence a hall when he chose to sing. The tales grew, as tales do, until even those who had never seen him believed they had. Yet Richard's fame was not only the echo of steel, it was the echo of culture. In Eleanor's courts, his verses found listeners. He sang of loyalty, of honor, of battles fought not merely for land, but for something greater. Those who heard him spoke of a prince who could both conquer with sword and captivate with song. Thus his reputation stretched in two worlds. Among knights, he was a warrior beyond compare. Among poets, he was a voice of power and longing. Rarely had one man carried both with such weight. And so the name Richard began to travel, carried by merchants, by travelers, by pilgrims returning from far-off lands, carried by troubadours whose songs lingered in the memory long after their voices had faded, carried even by enemies who spoke it not in mockery but in reluctant respect. The boy had become a man, the prince had become a commander, and the commander was becoming legend. The Plantagenet family was not a hearth of warmth, it was a storm of pride, a house where every son carried both privilege and ambition. Richard's elder brother, Henry the young king, was crowned in his father's lifetime, yet his crown was but a symbol. He held the title of king, but no true power. Frustration burned within him, and envy sharpened his voice. He sought to command, but always felt the weight of Richard's shadow. Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, was clever, sly, and ever restless. He spoke with honeyed words, but his heart beat with schemes. Those who watched him said that Geoffrey smiled too easily, and that every smile hid a dagger. John, the youngest, carried none of the lands that his brothers possessed. He was called Lackland, and yet within that emptiness, ambition festered. John learned to move quietly, to whisper into ears, to play the long game. He would wait, and he would strike when the moment came. At the center stood Henry II, a king of iron, ruling with clenched fists, unwilling to loosen his hold even for his sons. He believed himself eternal. He believed no son could yet carry the empire he had forged, and so he held the reins tight, too tight. The result was inevitable. Rivalries turned to rebellions. The brothers rose against the father, sometimes together, sometimes apart. Eleanor herself sided with her sons against Henry. What began as a family became a battlefield. Richard's role in this storm was fierce and clear. He fought with skill, leading men into sieges, holding ground where others faltered. Yet even as he battled, he learned bitter truths, that loyalty could fracture, that blood was no shield against betrayal, that in the Plantagenet house, trust was a fragile thing. The young king burned with jealousy of Richard's fame. Their quarrels were sharp, their contests endless. When Henry the young king died suddenly of illness, whispers spread. Some said it was God's judgment, others said it was fate clearing the path for Richard. Whatever the truth, Richard's path toward kingship grew clearer, even as grief and rivalry carved scars upon his heart. Geoffrey, too, would not live to see peace. He died in a tournament, trampled beneath horses, his ambitions silenced in dust. But John remained. The youngest, the hungriest, he watched and he waited, and Richard knew that though brothers shared blood, they did not always share loyalty. Thus the house of Henry and Eleanor was both vast and broken, an empire larger than any in Europe, yet fractured by the very sons meant to guard it. Every feast could turn to a quarrel, every alliance could sour into suspicion. And in the center of it all stood Richard, sometimes ally, sometimes rival, always marked by destiny. This was the crucible of his youth. Not only battles in fields, but battles at tables, in halls, in whispered words carried by courtiers. And from these storms, Richard emerged harder, sharper, and more certain of his place. The Lionheart was not only forged by enemies abroad, he was forged by the fire of his own blood. The reign of Henry II, mighty though it had been, could not last forever. This 2000 King of Iron had forged an empire greater than any before him. Yet even iron bends with time. Age crept upon him. Weariness shadowed his steps. And the storm he had raised within his own family pressed against him without mercy. Richard had fought against his father before, standing with Eleanor and his brothers in rebellion. He had tasted both defiance and defeat. But now, with his brothers gone, Henry the young king dead, Geoffrey lost to the dust of a tournament, Richard stood as the strongest son. And John, ever restless, whispered at the edges, waiting for his moment. The final struggle between father and son was bitter. Henry clung to his lands, unwilling to surrender power. Richard demanded his inheritance, demanded his place not as child, but as heir. Their quarrels were no longer whispers in halls. They were battles across fields, sieges upon castles, the clash of swords that echoed from Anjou to Normandy. In the end, it was not armies alone that broke Henry, it was betrayal. When he looked upon the lists of those who had risen against him, he saw a name he had not expected: John. The son he had loved most, the son he had sought to protect, had turned against him. And in that moment, Henry's heart faltered. The King of Iron, who had faced so many storms, could not endure the storm within his own blood. Illness seized him. His body, once unyielding, grew weak. And as he lay dying, he spoke words few forgot. Shame. Shame on a conquered king. When Henry passed, the weight of the empire shifted. The crown that had once pressed upon his brow now sought a new bearer, and all eyes turned to Richard. In July of 1189, Richard was crowned King of England. The ceremony was heavy with incense, with bells, with chants that rolled like thunder through the cathedral. Crowds pressed close to see him. Knights bowed their heads. Priests lifted their voices in blessing. In crown itself was more than gold. It was the weight of an empire stretched across lands and seas. England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine. Territories vast and restless, bound together only by the strength of the man who wore the crown. And now that man was Richard. He did not step into kingship timidly. He carried himself as if he had been waiting all his life. His bearing was steady, his gaze unshaken. Those who watched him swore that the crown seemed made for him, that it did not crush him, but rather magnified him. Yet even in his coronation there was unease. For Richard was not a king of England alone. He was a king whose heart was fixed upon Jerusalem. And though he had just taken his father's throne, his gaze already turned eastward, toward the Holy Land, toward the call of the cross. Thus, with Henry buried and John silenced, for now, Richard rose. The boy had become a man, the man had become a king, and the king was already preparing to leave his realm behind, to seek glory in lands far from his own. The crown had only just settled upon Richard's brow, yet already his eyes were turned eastward. He had sworn, even before his father's death, that he would take the cross, that he would march to Jerusalem. And now, as King of England, that vow became command. The call of the crusade thundered across his realm. Messengers rode through towns and villages, carrying banners marked with the cross. Priests preached from pulpits, their voices fierce with passion, calling men to take up arms, to leave behind fields and families for the sake of Christendom. And in every corner of the kingdom, the sound of preparation began. The southern ports swelled with life. Carpenters hammered day and night, shaping timber into ships. Smiths bent over their forges, sparks flying, as swords and arrowheads were born in fire. Women stitched banners of red and white, crosses upon them, shining like blood against snow. The air rang with the rhythm of work, with the pulse of expectation. Men came from far and wide, knights in polished mail, their shields painted with lions, eagles, and forgotten sigils. Archers with bundles of arrows slung across their backs, goose feather fletchings sharp as wings. Peasants and squires, wide-eyed, clutching spears with hands more used to plows. All gathered, drawn by loyalty, by faith, by the promise of glory. Markets transformed into mustering grounds. Merchants sold salted meat, dried fish, wheels of hard cheese, and barrels of ale. Armor-smiths fitted breastplates, adjusting buckles until they clung close to the body. Mothers pressed tokens into the hands of sons, small crosses, carved trinkets, locks of hair. Farewells were spoken not with certainty, but with trembling hope. And in the midst of it all, Richard himself appeared. He did not remain hidden in palaces. He walked among his men at the ports, inspecting ships, speaking to captains, offering words that steadied trembling hearts. To see their king among them was to believe the journey possible, for if he did not fear, why should they? Before their departure, great masses were held, cathedrals filled, until stone walls trembled with voices raised in prayer. Incense choked the air, rising like smoke from sacrifice. Priests lifted the cross high, blessing swords, blessing shields, blessing the very bodies of those who would march. Richard knelt before the altar, head bowed, his vow renewed in silence. This was not preparation alone. It was transformation. The kingdom itself shifted, turned, bent toward the east. Every coin collected, every cart loaded, every prayer whispered was a thread in a vast tapestry, a tapestry woven for one purpose: to send the Lionheart to Jerusalem. And when all was ready, when the ships groaned with supplies and the armies swelled like rivers flowing to the sea, the horizon itself seemed to wait. The sails, white against the sky, trembled with the promise of departure. And the people of England watched, breathless, as their king prepared to leave not only his throne, but the very heart of his kingdom, for the sake of a holy vow. The day of departure came. The ports of the south roared with sound, the crack of ropes, the creak of masts, the shouts of sailors as sails unfurled like wings against the sky. The sea, vast and endless, waited to swallow the fleet whole. Richard's army filled the ships. Knights in mail crowded the decks, their shields stacked, their swords strapped close. Archers sat with quivers at their sides, arrows bundled like sheaves of grain. Horses, restless and stamping, snorted in the holds below, their strength caged by timber walls. Supplies filled every corner: barrels of water, sacks of grain, salted meat, dried fish. The ships groaned under the weight, yet still they pressed forward. As the sails caught the wind, a cheer rose from the shore. Families stood weeping, waving, crossing themselves as their sons vanished into the horizon. Mothers whispered prayers into the salt air. Children called out names that faded into the cry of gulls. And then, only the sea remained. The voyage was long and merciless. At dawn, the decks glistened with dew and salt spray. At noon, the sun scorched, beating down until armor burned hot against the skin. At night, the sea grew black as ink, the stars wheeling above like silent witnesses. The storms came without warning. Clouds gathered like armies, lightning splitting the sky, waves rising like mountains. Men clung to rigging with raw hands as the ships pitched and heaved. Barrels burst loose, horses screamed below deck, and prayers rose louder than the thunder. Some ships vanished, swallowed whole by the sea. Others limped onward, sails torn, masts cracked. And yet, there were nights of calm, when the sea stretched smooth as glass, and the wind carried the scent of distant shores. On such nights, the soldiers gathered by lantern and firelight. They sang hymns, voices trembling yet steady. They told stories of home, of wives, of fields they might never see again. And in their midst, Richard often sat silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon. For the king carried not only the weight of his own vow, but the weight of every soul aboard. When men faltered, he steadied them with words few but he could speak. He reminded them that beyond the waves lay Acre, and beyond Acre, Jerusalem, that their suffering was not meaningless, but a road to glory. Weeks bled into months. The fleet touched at Sicily, at Cyprus, lands both welcoming and hostile. Markets buzzed with foreign tongues, palms swayed in winds warmer than England had ever known. Here, Alliances were made, treaties sealed, enemies subdued. For Richard did not sail as a pilgrim alone, he sailed as a king, and kings left their mark wherever they stepped. But always the sea called him back. Its waves, endless and eternal, seemed to test him with every mile. And Richard met the test as he met all others, with steady hand, with unyielding will, with the calm of one who would not be broken. Thus the fleet pressed on, through storm and silence, through loss and hope, toward the coast of the Holy Land, where destiny waited. When at last the fleet reached the shores of the Holy Land, the men saw not glory, but ruin. Before them lay the city of Acre, a city besieged for 2 long years, its walls scarred, its gates broken, its fields blackened, and around it, a camp of misery. Tens of thousands had gathered there, Franks, Germans, Italians, men from every corner of Christendom. Their banners drooped in the sun, their tents sagged with mildew. The ground was mud and filth, churned by endless feet. The stench of rot clung to the air, for disease walked among the soldiers as surely as any enemy. Richard's men, weary from the sea, stepped into a world of suffering. They saw bodies carried to shallow graves. They heard the coughs of men too weak to rise, the moans of fevered knights who once had been proud. Food was scarce, water fouled quickly in the heat. Every day hunger gnawed, and death chose its victims. Yet still the siege continued. Engines hurled stones at Acre's walls, battering them by day and night. Archers loosed arrows until their fingers bled. Tunnels were dug beneath towers, filled with timber and pitch, set alight to bring the stone crashing down. And from the city, defenders answered with fire and fury, refusing to yield. Into this chaos came Richard. Though he himself fell ill with fever, he did not retreat to comfort. Carried on a litter, pale but unyielding, he commanded his forces. Even sick, his presence burned brighter than most men in health. Knights swore that his voice, hoarse though it was, gave them strength to rise when their bodies begged them to fall. He ordered engines built stronger, towers raised higher. He led assaults that battered the city's defenses until stone cracked and mortar groaned. When enemies sallied forth, he met them with steel, cutting through their ranks with fury that seemed born not of flesh, but of fire. And yet even Richard could not banish the suffering. Disease still stalked the camp, men still starved. All around, the cries of the dying mingled with the clash of battle. The siege was not glory, it was endurance, a test of will more than of strength. Month after month, the struggle dragged on. The sun scorched the plain, the rains turned it to mire. Still the armies pressed, hammering against walls that refused to fall. But at last, with Richard's engines roaring and his banners pressing forward, Acre's gates shuddered open. The city, broken and spent, surrendered. For a moment, relief swept the camp. Prayers rose, banners lifted, songs of triumph filled the air. But the ground was still heavy with graves. The air was still heavy with sorrow. Victory had come, but at a price so vast it could scarcely be measured. Thus Richard's first true mark upon the Holy Land was written not only in conquest, but in suffering endured, in the hunger, the fever, the cries of the lost, and in the unyielding will of a king who would not let despair claim him. After Acre had fallen, the path did not end. Richard turned his gaze south, toward Jaffa, toward Jerusalem itself. But between him and that holy prize stood Saladin. Saladin's name carried weight across the world, a leader of steel and faith, respected even by his enemies. His armies shadowed Richard's every move, and as the Lionheart's host marched along the coast, burdened by heat and dust, Saladin struck again and again, raids, ambushes, arrows darkening the sky. The march was agony. The sun blazed without mercy, armor burning hot upon the flesh. Thirst gnawed at the throats of men, their lips cracked, their steps heavy. From the dunes came the sound of horns, the thunder of hooves, the hiss of arrows. Yet Richard held his army firm, shields locked, lines unbroken. For discipline was the wall stronger than stone. At last, near the city of Arsuf, the battle could not be delayed. Saladin gathered his forces, swift horsemen, archers whose shafts seemed endless, warriors driven by faith. Richard arrayed his knights, their lances gleaming, their banners snapping in the salt wind from the sea. The two greatest commanders of the age stood opposed, the earth itself trembling between them. The battle began with a storm of arrows. They fell like rain, rattling upon shields, piercing mail, cutting down men and horses alike. The air filled with dust, with cries, with the metallic stench of blood. Still, Richard forbade a charge. Still, he held his knights tight, their patience strained to the breaking point. At last, when the moment came, Richard gave the signal. The knights spurred forward, lances leveled, hooves pounding like thunder across the plain. They crashed into Saladin's ranks with a force that shattered the line. Steel clashed with flesh. The ground shook beneath the weight of impact. The Lionheart himself rode at the front, his sword rising and falling, his presence blazing brighter than the sun. Again and again the charge struck. The lines broke, the enemy scattered. And though Saladin rallied, though his warriors fought with unshaken courage, the tide had turned. The Christians held the field. The battle was theirs. Yet when the dust cleared, there was no mockery, no scorn. For Richard looked upon Saladin not as a foe to be despised, but as a warrior to be honored. And Saladin in turn spoke of Richard with respect rare between enemies. It was said that each saw in the other not only a rival, but a reflection. The victory at Arsuf lifted hearts. Songs spread of Richard's courage, of his command, of the day the lion roared and the crescent bent. Yet Jerusalem still lay ahead. And though the road was open, it was long, and filled with trials yet to come. Thus, Arsuf was written in memory, not only as a clash of armies, but as the meeting of two great spirits, a storm of steel, a storm of faith, a storm that would echo for centuries. Would mean destruction, that to seize the holy city only to lose it days later would be worse than never having touched it at all. And in the end, Richard listened to reason over passion. The decision was agony. To stand within sight of Jerusalem, yet not to march upon it, felt like betrayal to many. Tears turned to fury, prayers to curses. Yet Richard bore the burden in silence, for he knew that a king must think not only of glory, but of survival. And so the army turned back, their footsteps heavy, their voices hushed, their eyes glancing behind them at the city that had shimmered like a dream upon the horizon. They had seen it. They had touched it with their gaze, but they had not entered, and that wound would remain. Thus Jerusalem became a ghost in Richard's story, a hope glimpsed, a prayer unfulfilled. The Lionheart had roared at Arsuf, had broken Acre's walls, but here, before the gates of the holy city, he was silent, not defeated, not disgraced, but restrained by reason, by fate, by the weight of history itself. The crusade had not ended in triumph. Jerusalem still stood beyond reach, and though Richard's name burned with glory at Acre, at Arsuf, across all the Holy Land, the Lionheart now turned his face homeward. The sea carried him back, but not to peace. Storms tore his fleet apart. Some ships were driven onto hostile shores, others swallowed whole by waves. Richard himself was forced to land far from safety, in lands where enemies waited in shadow. He traveled in disguise, cloaked as a humble pilgrim, but a king's presence cannot be hidden long. In taverns and villages, whispers stirred. His stride was too proud, his bearing too noble, his voice too steady. It was said that even when he wore rags, the Lionheart could not be mistaken for a lamb.
Near Vienna, fate closed its hand. Leopold of Austria, long offended by Richard's pride, set his men upon him. The king was seized, stripped of his disguise, bound in chains. From there, he was delivered into the hands of the Emperor Henry, who sought not only a captive, but a treasure. The halls that had once echoed with Richard's command now echoed with his captivity. The iron of shackles replaced the weight of his crown. He, who had commanded thousands, now sat in silence behind walls of stone, and Europe gasped. The Lionheart, imprisoned. News spread like wildfire. Across England, across Aquitaine, across Normandy, voices rose in shock and fear. Without their king, the realm trembled. And yet, amid the sorrow, there was also resolve. For the people of England, though burdened and weary, would not let their king rot in chains. A ransom was demanded, vast, almost impossible. 150,000 marks of silver, a sum so great it threatened to strip the land bare. Yet still the people gave. Nobles melted treasures, churches emptied coffers, peasants offered coins saved over lifetimes. Every village, every hall, every cathedral echoed with the same vow: to bring the king home. And as silver piled in coffers, as messengers carried the ransom across borders, Richard waited. He did not break, he did not beg. Even in chains, he carried himself as king. Those who guarded him said that when he spoke, it was as though the walls themselves leaned closer to listen, that even captive, the Lionheart commanded. Months passed. Winter cloaked the land, spring thawed it again, and at last the ransom was paid. The chains were struck from his wrists, the doors of stone swung open. The lion was free. Thus Richard returned, not with triumph of conquest, but with triumph of endurance. He had been tested by battle, tested by storm, tested by chains. And still he remained. The crown awaited him, the realm awaited him, and the Lionheart walked once more into the light of his destiny. Freedom does not come without cost. For Richard, the price of his release was heavier than gold, heavier than stone. It was the lifeblood of his realm. The ransom demanded by the emperor was staggering: 150,000 marks of silver, enough to drain a kingdom, enough to strip the altars bare. It was said that no greater ransom had ever been sought for a king. In England, the call went out. Every village, every hamlet, every monastery felt its echo. Priests stood before their congregations, urging sacrifice. Nobles gave jewels, melted goblets, emptied vaults. Peasants parted with coins meant to feed them through winter. Even widows offered their wedding rings. Even children placed copper pennies in trembling hands. The churches were stripped of treasure. Candlesticks of gold, crosses of silver, reliquaries studded with gems, all carried away, all melted into ingots, all weighed upon the scales of ransom. The toll was immense, and yet the people gave willingly, for they believed that the king who had fought for them, who had stood at Acre and at Arsuf, must not perish in chains. Meanwhile, Richard endured his captivity. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. Behind stone walls he sat, shackles biting into his flesh, silence heavy around him. Yet he did not falter. Even in the dark, he carried himself as though he still wore his crown. Guards whispered that when Richard prayed, it was not the prayer of a captive, but of a king awaiting his throne. Songs began to spread even in captivity. Troubadours carried tales of the lion in chains, of his patience, of his... They sang that iron could bind his body, but not his spirit, that no prison could dim the fire that burned within him. These songs reached England, stirring the people, strengthening their resolve to pay the ransom at any cost. And at last, the silver crossed borders. Wagons laden with treasure rolled through forests and fields, guarded by knights sworn to their burden. The emperor counted the marks, weighed them, measured them, and when the last ingot was set upon the scale, the price was declared complete. The chains were unlocked. The man who had once been dragged like a captive rose like a king. He stepped into the cold air of morning, no crown upon his brow, no throne beneath him, yet those who saw him swore he looked every inch a monarch. The journey home began, but home was not what it had been. The land groaned beneath the weight of the ransom. Families struggled where coins had been taken. Churches stood bare where treasures had once gleamed. And yet, in their sacrifice there was pride, for they had bought back their king, and that purchase bound them to him with chains stronger than iron, chains of loyalty, of shared suffering. Thus the Lionheart returned to freedom. But he returned marked by the cost, his people poorer, his kingdom burdened, his own heart tempered by captivity. The ransom had been paid in silver, but its true currency was faith. And in that faith, Richard found a strength that no prison could take from him. Years had passed since Jerusalem's horizon. Richard returned not to peace, but to struggle. For the crown of England was never a crown of rest. Wars simmered, borders trembled, and France pressed ever harder against his realm. The Lionheart marched once more, this time not across deserts and seas, but across the green hills of his own lands. It was in Limousin, in the shadow of the castle of Châlus, that fate prepared its last ambush. The fortress was small, its defenders few, yet rumor spread that treasure lay within, gold freshly unearthed, hidden from his due. Richard, ever a warrior king, would not let defiance stand. The siege began with the rhythm of engines, stones pounding against walls, arrows whispering through the air. Tents rose once more, fires lit the night, drums and horns echoed across the fields. For Richard, it was another war, another test. Though his body carried the scars of years, his strength marked by the weight of age and battle. On the evening of March 26th, 1199, Richard walked the line of siege. He examined the walls, gauging the enemy's weakness. Above, defenders watched, their crossbows poised, their hearts tight with fear. One bolt flew, whether by chance or by fate, none can say. It struck Richard beneath the shoulder, piercing deep. The Lionheart staggered, blood burning hot against his mail. The wound festered. Physicians cut and cleaned, but the poison spread. Fever seized him, and the man who had withstood storms, chains, and countless battles now lay upon a bed of pain. Around him his captains wept in silence, for they knew the lion's roar was fading. Yet even in agony, Richard's spirit did not break. The man who had been king of armies, scourge of enemies, and terror of battlefields showed not fear, but calm. He summoned the archer who had shot him, a boy, trembling, dragged before his dying king. And Richard looked upon him with eyes no longer fierce, but steady, and spoke words that stunned all who heard. "Let him go. Harm him not. My death is no fault of his. It is the will of God." Thus, the Lionheart forgave, even as death closed in. It was not the sword that defined his last act, but mercy. Not the roar of battle, but the stillness of grace. On April 6th, Richard drew his final breath. The torches guttered, the halls fell silent. The banners hung heavy in sorrow. The lion who had crossed seas, who had battled Saladin, who had carried crown and chain alike, was gone. His heart was taken to Rouen, his body to Fontevraud, laid beside his father Henry. And yet, though stone claimed his flesh, his name could not be buried, for songs still carried it, and enemies still whispered it, and history itself bent to it. Richard the Lionheart. Thus ended the journey of the king who had lived as fire, fought as iron, and died with mercy. A king remembered not only for conquest, but for the spirit that no wound, no chain, no death could silence. When Richard's body was laid to rest, silence fell upon his realm. No clash of arms, no roar of command, no song of victory broke the stillness, only the echo of what had been, and what could never be again. Yet silence is never empty. In the quiet halls of Aquitaine, troubadours lifted their voices. They sang of the boy who had learned both scripture and song. They sang of the youth who had led armies before he had known peace. They sang of the king who crossed seas, who defied storms, who faced Saladin with courage unshaken. Their melodies drifted from castle to village, carried by memory, carried by love. In England, his people remembered not only the burden of the ransom, but the pride of the lion. They told their children that their king had been more than mortal, that even in chains he had stood taller than emperors, that even in death his mercy had been greater than vengeance. And in the East, among his enemies, his name was not cursed, but honored. Saladin himself, though rival and foe, spoke with respect of Richard. It was said that he called him the greatest knight he had ever known, that he saw in the Lionheart a spirit equal to his own. For even across the lines of faith, even across the clash of sword and crescent, honor recognized honor. Time passed. Other kings rose, other wars were fought, other crowns glittered and faded. But Richard's name did not vanish. It lived in chronicles inked by monks, in songs carried by minstrels, in whispers spoken beside hearth fires. It lived in the memory of Europe as the image of a king who was both warrior and poet, both conqueror and troubadour. And 13, the Lionheart became more than a man. He became a symbol, a vision of courage, of fire, of the restless spirit that seeks beyond itself. For though Jerusalem remained beyond his grasp, his story reached further than any city's walls. Even now, centuries later, when the name of Richard is spoken, it carries weight. Not only the weight of battles fought, but the weight of ideals, that a king can be strong yet merciful, fierce yet noble, mortal yet eternal in memory. Thus the lion sleeps, yet never dies. His roar lingers in stone and song, in memory and in legend. Richard, Coeur de Lion. Richard, the Lionheart. Forever bound not by crown or chain, but by the silence of history that still speaks his name. Thank you for listening to The Sleep of Valor. May this story bring you calm, and may your dreams be guarded by knights of old. Good night.